We've got a mega trade that could change the entire landscape of the AFC. All that and more. It's time for Inside Coverage. Welcome to Inside Coverage, part of the Zero Blitz family. Usually I try and be cute and creative at the beginning of these shows, but let's face it, there's breaking huge news and we got to get right to it. Charles Robinson, Jori, Epstein. I'm Jason Fitz. We're going to break down the why and how. That's what we tell you every week. Y'all, I'm just sitting there this morning trying to get out of my workout, feeling all froggy. Everything's good. I walk out and all of a sudden I open up my phone and one of our bosses sends me a note and says, "Can you give me a reaction to the Diggs trade?" I didn't even know what was happening. I had no idea it went down. Like, these moments are why I love the NFL, because you just never know what's going to happen, when it's going to happen. See, Rob, I felt the joy down in my heart because I knew I was going to get to talk to you guys today, and we have big breaking news.
Yeah, this is a big one, and it's a interesting deal, I think, for the Buffalo Bills, because now you're looking at the wide receiver depth chart, and maybe you're scratching your head going, I don't know what Buffalo's doing here. How are they going to piece this together with this group of receivers? We can talk about that in a little bit. But I think what's really interesting here is you see Houston's going all in right now. I know a lot of people are focusing in on Buffalo. What does this mean for Josh Allen? What did it mean in terms of what happened with Stefon Diggs there? And is Buffalo's Super Bowl window now effectively at least closed or starting to close or disrupted significantly? I think the one thing we could do is we can look at Houston and say that the accelerator's pressed to the floor all the way. Okay, they've gone all in right now.
Rob's going to have to go to a Texans game this year.
Right. I'm in Houston.
Our reporter who lives in Houston is finally going to have to care about the local team.
I didn't say that, but anyway, they're clearly extremely relevant right now. When I talk to a few people, just sort of texting around the league, gauging interest and reaction, everybody comes away with the same take is, look, they know CJ Stroud right now, they have a window. They've got a quarterback who's up and running right now in a way that an accomplished veteran quarterback would be up and running. So take full advantage of that money situation right now, the rookie contract. They've got at least 4 years of control left if you consider they exercised that fifth-year option. They've now brought in Stefon Diggs. They poured money into Dalton Schultz, right? You have Nico Collins, who is playing on his fourth year. They could potentially do an extension early with him this year, but very much part of that offense moving forward, at least right now. That's how they feel. And then you've got Tank Dell, who's returning from a broken leg, but he's out running routes. I think they feel really good about where he's at in terms of his return to the team. Should be out there doing everything once training camp kicks off. Offensively, and remember too, Bobby Slowick, their offensive coordinator, is still in the fold right now, which you also want to take advantage of because he's going to be at the top of a lot of head coaching lists as he was the last rotation. So look, shifting into this gear for the Texans makes a ton of sense. And frankly, if I were anybody that's sitting in that division with the Texans, I'd be a little worried about where they're going moving forward, because if CJ Stroud can be the guy he was as a rookie, and you would expect he can improve on that, they have an absolutely lethal set of skill position players. And let's not forget they added Joe Mixon too for a bona fide run game.
Yeah, I think you make such a good point. I hadn't thought about the timing with Bobby Slowick and how few seasons you may have left with him. Seasons maybe shouldn't even be plural in that sentence. But I think that when you look at what they did, it's just this reminder. Like, every exec I talked to today, and I texted several, was like, look what you can do when you have a rookie quarterback contract. And it's kind of like, if you hit on that rookie, and I know we've been talking about this since the Russell Wilson days, but even then it was more like his defense was getting probably more credit than him, even if he deserved credit for what he did as well. And so it's like, this is just such a market inefficiency that is hard to find, and you need to stock up while you can do it. For the Bills, though, it's pretty crazy. I mean, they're taking on a $31 million dead cap hit this year alone. Like, they're taking it all in 1 year to not have Stefon Diggs. They got a second rounder for next year, but they also traded a sixth and a seventh. So they really were ready to move on. But I was crunching some numbers. I mean, I have my whole notepad of receptions, targets, all the different things. And after they fired Ken Dorsey midseason and moved to Joe Brady, Stefon Diggs' productions pretty much dropped in half in terms of receiving yards. He went from 86.8 to 43.1 if you include playoffs for the 10 games before, the 9 games after. And he had 7 touchdowns in those 10 games with Ken Dorsey coordinating, and 1 touchdown in the regular season, none in the playoffs in those final 9 games. And I think even more concerning for that if you're Buffalo and if you're Stefon Diggs, is that they won a lot more when he wasn't producing. When he was going off, they were 5-5. When he was a lot less effective and he was doing a lot less, they were 6-1, and then they went 1-1 in the playoffs. And so you do not want to be the star receiver, especially when you're as vocally passionate, we could say, as he is, on a team whose success looks inverse to your production. And so when you get to that point, you see how much he blew up last offseason already. I mean, he had to leave, OTA's mini camp one day. That was when he was still a really big factor in the offense. And I kind of get why Buffalo was like, okay, now this is the time. And the last thing I'll say is just this idea of like, yes, they will take this hit in 2024, but I really look at what Arizona did with DeAndre Hopkins in terms of what this means. Like, yeah, they had a lot of money to eat one year, but now what? They're going to end up this year with Marvin Harrison Jr. or Malik Neighbors or one of those top receivers. They no longer have money. They're going to be able to offset their quarterback who's not on a rookie contract anymore with the receiver who is. Like, there is a pattern for why this makes sense for a team, even if it's harder for us to see, because anytime you have Josh Allen, you are in a window.
I just think, and I got to stress here, in my mind, two things can be true. Because, Jori, everything you point out about the dip in production is important in its context. But also, we all watched that Buffalo offense last year. And at times, it looked like the offense play calling was essentially roll the ball out, let Josh Allen run around, and pray to God he can find somebody open. Like, that was not an offense that most of us were shaking in our shoes saying, this is a well-coordinated, well-run machine. So while I think that the dip in production is an important part of the context in this conversation, I also think the offense itself in Buffalo felt broken. So I don't know how much of that I lay at the feet of Stefon Diggs.
Well, one thing, too, though, you have to understand is the offensive production on his part, it wasn't that he just all of a sudden stopped producing. They geared it that way. Go and look at his snap percentages. And right about mid-November, he starts to kind of get phased out a little bit. And other players got phased into that offense. So they started to tilt away from him. And part of me wonders if, like how much of this is it just wearing thin? How much is it, there was just this drama that started to percolate. It was consistent. A lot of it seemed to be aimed at Josh Allen. It felt very similar to what happened with Stefon Diggs and Kirk Cousins at the end in Minnesota. Now you're also talking about a player who's, you're talking about 30-year-old wide receiver, highly paid, and you're in a situation where, again, as Jori said, you're paying the quarterback. There are other things in play here. And how long are you going to deal with this? Then you make these alterations for the offense. He's less of a part of that passing game going down the stretch. And then the offense seemed to be more functional. Josh Allen seemed to be functional that second half of the season. And so the thought process starts to begin like, okay, could we live without this guy? Yeah, we probably could. Like, it's not great, but we can. And now what we're removing out of the equation is Trayvon Diggs, tweeting about Stefon Diggs needs to get out of Buffalo, and Stefon Diggs never doing anything about that. Like, never. It reminded me of like Odell Beckham Jr. when things start to happen in Cleveland, where, people in his family are going after the organization. They're going after Baker Mayfield, and Odell Beckham Jr. is doing nothing. He's doing nothing. He's not getting in between it. He's not trying to tamp it down, and after a while, that becomes a really big problem in the organization. And so I think there is a certain element of a protective measure here by the Bills where they're like, look, another season of this could get more and more focused on Josh. We don't think this is a Josh conversation. We think that Josh is going to be fine. We just got to move on from this situation. We need a fresh start here. And so I think effectively what ended up happening was at the combine. Now, when I talk to people in retrospect, they're like, yeah, it was, look, at the combine, you kind of knew this guy was available. If you wanted to talk to the Bills about a trade, it was just where was the compensation going to land? How much of a high gear did they have to move on, considering the cap hit they were going to have to take? And I think really when things solidified here, it was when the Houston Texans traded their first round pick to basically collect 2 second-round picks from the Minnesota Vikings. And that opened up the opportunity for the Texans to say, okay, now we can deal a second-round pick. That's going to be the centerpiece of this trade that the Bills want. And we don't have to give them our 2024 compensation. We want to keep that 2024 pick. We can scoot that to 2025. They're not getting a 2025 pick from anybody else. That's a second rounder. That deal between the Texans and the Vikings really is what I think opened the doors to this ultimately happening. And I still really, I think a large measure of this was not just the production and the changes in the offense and what happened the second half of the season. I do think a large part of this was we're just not going to keep dealing with this. Like we can't continue to be in a situation where it seems to be getting worse and worse and worse. And then a year from now, we're looking at maybe somebody will give us a sixth for the guy. That's really where this was headed.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because I talked to multiple people who worked with Steph in Minnesota today, and they were like, we know that he has these emotional outbursts and it didn't end particularly well there. We also loved him and would like vouch for his character any day. And there's this sort of idea of like, he's hyper competitive. How does he channel that? And that I think is probably the biggest risk that Houston is taking on is you seem to have such a good dynamic in the locker room last year, which had not been the case for the previous years. I mean, think about the Brandon Cook situation there. Think about DeAndre Hopkins. Think about Bill O'Brien, Deshaun Watson. I mean, there are a lot of cultural challenges that they were facing. The nature of the timing and how much dead cap they were willing to take signifies that this was more than just an offense question and more than just an on-field question. I'd still be fascinated to see what Buffalo does in terms of relying on Josh Allen, because to me, the question is not only how many targets is a different receiver going to get and a different tight end and who the targets are going to go to, but also they seem to go toward the run game more in the second half of last year with Joe Brady in a way that was really effective for their offense and their defense. Obviously, James Cook was a feature and part of that. Like, not just Josh Allen. Like, you don't want Josh having to do what he did against Philly. But I think that if Josh can play Superman less and he can rely on a receiver who it's easy to take out of the game, if you have a L'Jarius Sneed type on the other side, who, by the way, they'll be in the same division, that might be a better postseason formula than the one they've done in the past, where it's fully dependent on Josh and it looks awesome sometimes. And it looks like a lot of things just went wrong and a lot of balls just went to the other team in other moments.
And an element of timing here too, that I think is important. This is happening after the combine, right? So what have the Bills gotten a chance to look at? The wide receiver class, right? They're sitting there and they're looking at the wide receiver class and they're going, okay, here's where our pick is going to be. Now, Brandon Beane has done what? He's shown us he will move up in a draft. Well, how far does Brandon Beane now? We'd all assume, given what the wide receiver room is. Now, they could still obviously address this in other ways as we approach the draft. Maybe some other veteran wide receivers poke around on, I don't want to say Devontae Adams or anyone else, but I'm just saying poke around some other veteran wide receivers who could potentially still be available going into that draft. But I think once you see, let's say LSU's Brian Thomas Jr., right? You see this guy go out. He runs a sub 4.40, right? And then you look at the route tree that LSU had him run. A lot of vertical stuff, a lot of big play down the field. The type of game that, to me, when I look at Josh Allen, I'm like, yeah, that's the kind of vertical guy you want. Not, okay, great. He's not like a yak guy, catches balls and then takes off and tacks on another 5, 7, 10 yards after a catch. But he is the big play downfield vertical receiver. Those were consistently the routes that LSU had him running. I think that would fit well with a Josh Allen and the strengths that he brings to the table. So I also think not only getting the value out there, not only Houston being able to maneuver itself to getting the draft compensation it needed to be able to trade for him. I think for Buffalo, you wanted to be able to see a little bit of that wide receiver class and understand where can we get the replacements for a Stefon Diggs, or at least the younger guys that we're now going to bring into the fold next.
Isn't this the inevitable part of the seesaw too, like a teeter-totter, whatever you called it growing up, where early on you felt like you needed to every team does this. You got to put as much talent around a quarterback. And then as the quarterback starts to blow up, the presumption is going to be that just like he needed talent to make him better early on, now he becomes the balloon that rises everybody else. Josh Allen is that guy, right? Like, I think the hard part about this, if I'm a Bills fan, is that I'm looking at my favorite team saying, 2 years in a row, we've been within seconds of finding a way to beat the Chiefs and finding a way to advance. I mean, every single year, you're 1 or 2 plays away from saying, hey, we could have won the Super Bowl. And now the answer to getting those 1 or 2 plays is to get rid of Stefon Diggs, to bring in a rookie wide receiver that if you told anybody picking in this year's draft, they could pick somebody with the production of Stefon Diggs, they'd be doing cartwheels in the streets, right? Like, so that's not a given. So I understand, because everything we're saying makes sense. I think the point of this with Josh Allen to me is that the team's telling you they believe he can make a star out of anybody, right? Like, that's got to be their only answer.
But Fitz, when you say that, I think you put it more as a what's going to happen in 2 months, because one of the execs that I was talking to today texted and they said, I think for Buffalo, it's an attempt to not make a 3-year project into a 5-year one. They gave it a run with that core. It's old and in decline. Brandon probably felt like he needed to flip it to get a new group in with Allen to make a run. And I think that's the crux here, is that your window will never fully close as long as you have a quarterback like Josh Allen and like a lot and some of the other pieces that Buffalo has. But that doesn't mean you're best set up. And if you got really close, well, yes, you got close, but think about how you kind of had to, like, whatever the opposite of lumping into the playoffs is, like rushing into the playoffs with that last bit at the end of the season. And so I do think that this is not just about this year. This is about, you might have 10 more good years from Josh Allen. You might have 5. So how do you get the most starts to throw at the board over the next 5 years?
Remember, it's a strong wide receiver draft. Now, I think we're going to be saying that in perpetuity. I think forever, given how the other levels of football below the NFL have changed. It's always going to be a strong wide receiver draft. We're always going to have a million guys, and 4-3 is going to be the new 4-4, right? For wide receivers running. Let's look at the Houston element of this. You talk about the seesaw, and you're absolutely right in Buffalo, but you're also right in Houston as well, because Stefon Diggs now goes in there. And what do you have in Houston? You have an extremely young core, right? And now you have someone who comes in very experienced, highly competitive. As Jori said, for the longest time, the narrative was every time there was a problem with Stefon Diggs, he just cares so much. And he's so invested emotionally and all that stuff. And that's fine. That works for a couple of years. And then after a while, it's like, okay, great. We get it. But now people are starting to pile onto the quarterback. Now it's really starting to become a net negative for our quarterback. And that's why you part company in Minnesota. I think that's part of why you part company in Buffalo. Now he goes into Houston, where they need that guy. They need the leadership guy. They need him to be that voice on offense who is saying to CJ Stroud, here is how we compete on this level. Who's working with Tank Dell saying, all these things you bring to the table, let me show you some of the other tricks. Same with Nico Collins, another young guy. You've taken a very young set of skill position players around CJ Stroud and including CJ Stroud, and you've injected a veteran who should still have a few years of, I think, high level production, particularly working in the right kind of offense with the right quarterback with the right surrounding pieces. I don't have any reason to believe that Stefon Diggs shouldn't still be able to provide a ton to the Houston Texans. I think it's something they need as well. So, and it puts them in the state of Texas, not far from Trayvon Diggs, obviously, who's up in Dallas. I'm going to enjoy the, hey, Trayvon, maybe you need to come to the Texans talk starting, next season if there are any problems in Dallas. Hey, maybe you need to just, jump on 45 and head down to Houston for 2025 and beyond.
Which,
we can go ahead and start that now.
People from small states, like, it's a 4 or 5 hour drive. They're not close.
Yeah. Well, small states, but I mean Texas.
It's easier to get from New York to DC or Baltimore than it is Dallas to Houston. But C-Rob, what I would ask you is, do you have a sense of what Steph's reputation is in terms of the receiver room? Because I don't know, like, there are different receivers who'll be around in this league, some of whom will be the mentor type, will be the guy who's taking the guys after OTA practices and showing them how to run the route and how to work on their release, and other guys who are like, give me the ball and just watch what I do. And if he's the latter, you do have a risk here, because there are really talented receivers who are already there. Like, I know you can't be too good at something. And if you have a quarterback who can air it out like CJ Stroud, give him the weapons. And by the way, give him the weapons when he's jumping from year 1 to year 2, which is often a difficult transition moment for a quarterback. And now you'll have a different element that defenses couldn't study over the offseason. So I love that. But do you think it's more likely that Steph brings the receivers with him, or feels like he's competing with them and is not happy with how that competition and target share ends up?
I don't know. I mean, we have to see how the personalities work, but I can say this: he's better than anybody there. Like, they're good, they're talented, but they're young, right? Yeah. And I mean, to me, he is your X, right? He instantly walks in. He is your X. You have Nico Collins on the outside. Now you can put Tank Dell in the slot, which, by the way, Tank Dell can move around as well. He can play X at times as well on the outside, despite, his, I know he's basically 170 pounds. But it gives you a lot of versatility in that offense. And frankly, when I sit there and look at it, I don't know what teams are going to match up with when it comes to the Houston Texans.
Yeah.
Because all those guys can fly. Like they're all pretty fast. They're all, Diggs can do a lot of different things. He's a very competitive, not only route runner, he's competitive at the catch point. He's a true X receiver. He's a dominant, I still think, top 5 caliber guy when he's given the opportunity to be that in the offense, which he will in Houston. I think it'll open up opportunities for Nico Collins. I think it'll open up some opportunities for Tank Dell. Dalton Schultz, I get it. Are there enough balls to go around? And then you have Joe Mixon, who gives you, a verified running back who can probably hand it off to, 15, 20 times a game as well. I get what you're saying, and there is some danger there, and I don't know how that ultimately works itself out. But I can tell you this, so far, DeMeco Ryans has gone in there, and as a head coach, every player has been receptive to him. He's worked really well with a wide array of different personalities inside the Texans, and I think that matters. I think that DeMeco Ryans' personality matters, and what he brings to the table matters, and Slowick will probably be the most creative offensive coordinator that Diggs has worked with, I think, since when? Since Brian Daboll, probably? I mean, I think we could realistically say that. So there will be a honeymoon period, I think, at the very least.
There's one person that the Texans can ask about all of this, and it's Danielle Hunter. And they signed him in free agency from the Vikings. He was the teammate of Stefon's in Minnesota for several years. So if he was a bad teammate, if there was a bad experience, I would think they could go to him. That being said, I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second and just taking what you guys have said and the questions we have. If you've got a young quarterback and a young team that's ascending at this level, and then you're bringing in a player that 2 teams have said, nah, we're good. Essentially let him walk for cents on the dollar or taking salary cap hits to just get him out of the building. Are we underselling the issue that is part of the locker room culture that is going to now be part of a young locker room with the Texans? To me, if the Vikings walked away from him and the Bills walk away from him, and they're both teams that needed him at that time, that has to say something, no?
Okay, but what if he was right? What if he was right about Buffalo? Okay, what if he was right to be frustrated? There were clearly problems with the offensive coordinator spot, right? You don't fire a coordinator unless there are problems. There were clearly problems post Brian Daboll. We had this conversation, had nothing to do with Diggs, where we're like, what the hell's going on with Josh Allen? What about some of these risks that he's taking? What about some of the hero ball aspects? They missed Brian Daboll. We went through that whole conversation, had nothing to do with Stefon Diggs at that time, right? They never made it with Gabe Davis, right? Oh, Gabe Davis is going to turn into this and that. And there were all these proclamations of what he could be, and what happens? He goes somewhere else, and he never made it in Buffalo the way that we thought he would make it. I think there were enough underlying problems in Buffalo over the expansive time that he was there, plus the frustration of, God, we can't break through. We lose to Burrow. That is so disheartening. We lose to Mahomes. That's so disheartening. And those are like ceilings that are not going to go away. Mahomes is going to be there. He's always going to be there, right? And Burrow's he's going to come back healthy, right? And he's going to be in the mix there. And it's going to be Josh Allen and Burrow probably trying to figure out how the hell do we get through Mahomes. So I can't look at just this and say, well, it's all on Diggs. It's just, okay, 2 teams have told us the same story. There probably were reasons for him to be frustrated there at times. Was it always handled great? Probably not, especially when the social media stuff gets involved. And even a few days ago, someone remarks on X that, is Josh Allen benefited by having an elite wide receiver? Yes. Does he need one to be successful? No, something along those lines. And Diggs responds, you sure?
But Sarah, you make a good point. This also reminds me of Brandon Cooks, who is far from the same player as Stefon Diggs, but I did a story on him last year when the Cowboys traded for him. And it was interesting because he became the first player in NFL history to play for 4 teams to which he was traded. So he starts off with the Saints, gets traded to the Patriots, goes to Super Bowl with them, then gets traded to the Rams, gets the big mega contract, Super Bowl with them, then goes to Houston. Houston's a disaster, and that's putting it nicely, and then ends up in Dallas. And I kind of made it my point at that time, and maybe I should be doing this with Steph, to track down someone who worked at each of those teams while he was there to be like, what happened? Like, why did he get out of there? Or why did he get into where you were? And it was interesting because it wasn't one thing. And like Brandon Cooks was not a teammate. I mean, yes, when he was young in New Orleans and Sean Payton wasn't using him exactly how he wanted, was he happy? No, he wasn't. And he wanted a bigger role, which by the way, we're seeing that like he's not the only one in NFL history who doesn't get along perfectly with Sean Payton. Take from that what you may. But I do think there was a point where for him, it was like he was a number 2 receiver who was paid like a number 1 at some places. Houston was a disaster. His role wasn't like that. So it's kind of hard to tell. Like with Stefon Diggs, like obviously he's been the number 1, so there's less of that element. But it is hard to tell, like, is it the same reason that he ended up out of Minnesota and Buffalo? Or is there a little more nuance? And I don't know. I think Sierra makes an interesting point about receiver, but I will still have some questions about how he handles himself. And the last thing is like, I had some of the execs I was talking to were like, look, winning covers up a lot and helps a lot. Yeah. And so if you go to Buffalo, where if Buffalo didn't make it to the Super Bowl, in some ways, I think their season felt like a failure because they had already done everything else. Like it's kind of like the Cowboys. If they get to the NFC Championship, like the moon is probably going to fall in Dallas or something, and Jori will like pull it down with him because he'll be so excited. And so you are going to have such a different vibe in terms of what is the caliber of success. And so on one hand, he's going to want that individual production, but if he has the chance to like help bring the Texans, who already kind of like came up and arose anew last year, to that next level, to win the first playoff game in how many years, first playoff game to win in the post-Deshaun Watson era. And he's able to kind of like ride that wave. That, at least for the time being, should be able to keep the emotions in check, at least for now.
I mean, you mentioned the expectations. When we come back, I'll tell you what BetMGM's got as the expectations. It's pretty clear here, and we'll figure out what this means for everybody's Super Bowl contention. We'll do that when we come back. So we were just talking about expectations as Stefon Diggs is traded to the Texans, and BetMGM now has the Texans at plus 1,400 to win the Super Bowl. That ties them with Buffalo. So according to Vegas, they now see Houston and Buffalo in the same tier. And like, y'all, this is hard for me because Buffalo, they played at home last year in the playoffs. So we can look at that and say, oh my God, they had a home game in the playoffs. Also, a couple of weeks before the playoffs started, it looked like they might miss it entirely. So I'm not sure what to make of Super Bowl odds at this point, but certainly it feels like Buffalo has question marks now and Houston got stronger. So I guess the real question here, Jori, like when I say Houston elite, like, is that where we view the Texans now with this move? Does that make Houston, in the eyes of many, are they a Super Bowl contender, or is this just solidifying them to be a, division champion type contender?
I think they have an elite roster, which is to say that if you were to ask execs around the league or head coaches around the league, like rank the rosters you would want to coach from 1 to 32, I'd have to see if they're in the top 5 or 10, but I think they're in that top tier in terms of the talent they have. I think what that will translate to will be an important question. I think that if you're asking me now, I believe that Houston will probably win more games in the season than Buffalo, but what will that mean in the playoffs? That'll be more about the culture, more about what DeMeco's able to do in year 2. And really, a lot of this is going to come down to, what does CJ Stroud look like in year 2? I expect him to look great because he looked great in year 1, and the ways in which he looked great were not just some like rookie phenom doing one thing. Like he wasn't doing something crazy or just running all the time. Like he was just playing really smart football, making excellent decisions, reading defenses in a way that, as we know from the S2 league, or people were going to question if he was able to do that. So I think the ways in which he was succeeding in the game are sustainable, but that's what it will come down to. So if you give me that, like, I understand why Houston's odds are what they are, but in the playoffs, I just feel like there's like another level of what you need. And some of that is losing until you win, like losing in the playoffs, knowing what that feels like, and then getting over that hump years later.
Can you remember a time we've seen, and I'm just deferring to both of you and your general expertise around the league on this, like the tone around the way we talk about the Texans in 1 year has gone from disaster, nobody's going to want to coach there, they have no idea what they're doing, nobody wants to play there, this thing, it just looks terrible, they're going to have the first pick every year in the draft, to suddenly, wow, they have figured it all out. Like, C-Rob, I just think, you look at overall the tone around the Texans, rightfully so. They're being aggressive because they just hit so many home runs, it feels like, last year in their coaching hiring, in their draft process, in their free agency process. Like, I can't believe that this has only been a year.
Detroit was midway through Dan Campbell's second year, and I thought he was getting
point.
fired. I'm like, this dude getting fired. It's like, this is horrible. Everything's falling apart here. Detroit's just a complete and total mess. They finished the season on a run. They beat Green Bay to close it out, knock Green Bay out of the playoffs. And all of a sudden, that offseason, people were like, hey, I kind of like the Lions as a dark horse Super Bowl pick next year. Or I like the Lions as a dark horse, NFC title game pick. And what happened? They ran all the way to the NFC title game the following year. So it's not unprecedented. It is shocking, though, because Detroit didn't deal with what Houston did, in that after the Deshaun Watson fiasco, everything was wrong in the organization. It was like everything had burned to the ground. You'd fired 1 year coach after 1 year coach. And, the ownership, questions about Cal McNair. Is he a competent owner in the NFL? And where are they going to find a quarterback? And there's just so many different things. And even after they drafted Stroud and Will Anderson in the 2 and 3 slots, people were still picking them to have an awful season and be I remember having the argument with Frank Schwab where he was like, oh my God, they traded away.
That. The three of us were on the podcast.
Yeah, Frank Schwab's like, oh my God, they traded away a first round pick to be able and go and acquire another, high level elite draft pick. That's going to be the first pick in the draft next year. That's what everybody thought. And then all of a sudden we come out, and even in preseason, I remember watching Stroud in preseason and going, like, I don't know if this is going to work. Like, he seems rattled, or is it because the pockets aren't all totally clean? Like, what's the deal? Oh no, their offensive line is messed up and it's not going to be perfect in front of them. And then like a month into the season where I was like, oh my God, like what the hell is going on? Like, this is crazy. If anything, Houston, Detroit, some of these teams should be such a beacon to other franchises and fan bases in the NFL, because you really can pivot quickly. You just have to make a few really good key decisions right. Pick the right head coach. If you get the right coach and the right quarterback, things change really fast inside an organization. And I think we've kind of seen that. I mean, even Jared Goff, in a sense, has been part of that renaissance in Detroit, has been because Jared Goff showed up there. I didn't believe it. I was like, nah, come on, this is no way they're going to make this work. Most people felt that way. And then he did, and it was in unison with the head coach. And then other things kind of slotted into place. I think it's a great story for Houston. I think it's a great story in general for the NFL, that you can just see teams galvanize so quickly and turn their fortunes. And oh, by the way, it also showcases the template of what like Jori was talking about, this idea of it is real. When you hit on a quarterback in the draft, a rookie quarterback, that window is legit. Like and I think teams now know if they hit in year one, they know they've got their guy, pound it. Like, absolutely go for it as hard as you can in this 5-year window, because you got a chance here. And then it's going to kick in, as Fitz, you alluded to, it's going to kick in down the line that you got to pay him. And that means you're going to have to rob Peter to pay Paul, and that you're not going to be able to have the $25 million wide receiver. Or if you do, you're really not going to be able to have some of these other parts. This is like the salad days for Houston right now. The next couple of years, this is the really good period where you can make good on this rookie contract. As long as Jori said, let's see. Okay, it looks sustainable. The model of football that he showcased last year looks sustainable. Let's see if he can carry that into 2024.
See, Rob, I couldn't agree with you more that this trade is a great prism through which to study the whole league. And that's why this is so interesting. I had a friend ask me today, like, is Stefon Diggs that good of a player that this is really like groundbreaking news? Yes, he's a good player. Yes, this is happening on April 3rd when not a lot was happening this week. And even we podcasters were like, thank goodness we have this to talk about. But I also think it's a fascinating case study of how teams view roster building, both for Buffalo and for Houston. And it was interesting because when I was texting someone who works on another team today who's kind of, going through that rebuilding process and how are they going to figure it out? And I was like, it's pretty amazing how quickly Nick Caserio, the Houston Texans general manager, turned things around. And he took issue with it. And he said he actually had 2 pretty rough years, to the point where we didn't know what was going to happen to him. And then he turned things around. So I think it's probably more accurate and more precise to say that things turned around steeply in Houston than that they turned around quickly, which should make teams wonder, okay, what happens if we don't have a year or two when things work? And I don't think Chicago's at this point in their rebuild. I think they've kind of gone through the point in the rebuild. And unfortunately, I think that Justin Fields had to be their sort of sacrificial lamb of a quarterback during their early rebuild days. And Caleb Williams is going to reap the benefit of some of those scarce years. But if you're Washington, if you're New England, and it doesn't look good this year, and maybe it doesn't look good next year, and granted, you could look really good in a year because you have the quarterback and head coach coming in the same year. But I think it kind of should remind teams sometimes just like sticking with your plan for 2 years, believing in your scouting process, and also being willing to step out on a limb and be like, hey, we are going to take the second and third guys. Hey, we are going to believe so strongly in our scouting that we are willing to bet these are the guys we want. And because they're the guys we want and we believe in that so strongly, if we can get them on rookie deals for 5 years, rookie deal for 4 plus the 5th year option, we're going to have this advantage. So, I mean, it's just, I would imagine every front office in the league on Wednesday was looking at this trade being like, what does this mean for me? Where am I in the rebuild? Am I in the Buffalo stage? Am I in the Houston stage? Or am I in where one of them was 2 years ago?
I do want to point out, though, that this did happen in Houston, and I live here, and I can tell you that if there's any market where a general manager can come in, fire multiple coaches after 1 year, deal with the Jack Easterby stuff when that rolled through, the Deshaun Watson absolute unraveling, the questions about Cal McNair as an owner, like there's like spare few places in the NFL where you can have that happen and you aren't absolutely cannibalized by the fan base and the reporters. And I'm not knocking like reporters in Houston at all. I'm just saying that it's different here than it is. You can't, like, Philly would be a problem, right? Chicago going to be a problem. Like, there are certain places where it's, it's going to be some issues in some markets where you're going to get destroyed pretty fast. And it's interesting to me, by the way, that we're talking about Detroit, right? And then also Houston. Detroit was also another place where if you kind of look over the timeline of some of the coaches there, some of them probably got a little longer than they should have to make decisions. Sometimes the general managers in past years got a little longer than maybe they would have in other places, right? So I think even in the aspect of Detroit, getting it right, there were some elements in play there as well, just in terms of ownership patience. I remember the middle of that first year when it was like, is Dan Campbell going to get fired? And Sheila Ford came out and she said, no, I'm like, we're going to have patience. Like, she straight up came out and said, no, it's not. Like, it was like mid-season. I think
Campbell was in Denver, would he have survived?
I don't know. I really honestly, I can't say that I know he would have. It's less about the coach, I think, as the general manager. Because if you think about it, Nick Caserio weathered a lot of crazy stuff and wasn't fired. And I know general managers get a chance to hire typically 2 coaches, right? Hey, if 2 coaches don't work out, then it's, that's it and it's over. Or I just felt like there was a lot going on in Houston where I'm like, man, this guy's really, he's weathering it right now. Like, he's hanging on. But I'll also tell you this. I think if 2023 had gone 4-13,
oh yeah, whole
different situation, we're talking about from a general manager perspective. I don't know necessarily if Nick weathers a 4-13 season. And I mean, maybe he would, because, who knows, maybe D'Amico comes out and says, hey, this is on the right track. But it would have been tougher, I think, if they really would have slammed into a wall in 2023. I don't know that Nick maybe weathers that. Now he has, and hey, completely different situation now for his setup moving forward.
But when you guys talk about the prism, though, let me just point this out. Like, as much as this prism impacts like the way everybody sees where their team is and the advantage of the rookie deal, is this not the exact reason that we're talking every week about teams reaching at the quarterback position in this year's draft? Like CJ Stroud and the success, particularly that the Texans have at the quick turnaround. It's not just that they realize they got their guy. It's that they realize so quickly that they got their guy. Like, you can't say that about any of the other rookies. So right. Now everybody's looking at it and saying, well, God, look at that quick turnaround. So I think what's interesting here is that, number one, there are teams that are going to reach at the quarterback position because they're going to convince themselves that they have to have a CJ Stroud. And you know right away they're going to convince themselves of that. And I also think the quick success of DeMeco Ryans is going to create more conversation about, hey, do you know if you've got the coach and the quarterback combo very quickly? Like, we live in a less patient NFL today than we lived in 5, 6, 7 years ago at quarterback position. I think the same is going to start happening with coaches, because everybody's going to look at Houston and say, man, if you get it right, you get it right quickly, you know right away. Like, this is a dangerous prism in that sense, because everybody's going to try and replicate a scratch-off lottery process.
I mean, come on, we already fire coaches. We fire coaches fast now. I mean, like Frank Reich. Frank Reich
that's fair.
was a record firing. Now, granted, it's David Tepper, but I think at this point, in a lot of places, and Jori can speak to this, I mean, coaches don't last a long time.
Coaches don't last, and quarterbacks don't get to sit for a year. Like, the clock starts right when you get there. But I will say, I think that what you described, Fitz, is how a lot of people are going to view what Houston did. And I think that they're both mischaracterizations. Like, oh, that you got the right coach. Houston fired coaches back-to-back before they got DeMeco Ryans. It's not that they're just like, oh, yeah, it looks good. I mean, yes, it looks good, but they also got rid of people to get there. And you look at the quarterback, well, it wasn't the Texans who reached for C.J. Stroud. If anything, they moved down a spot because of that final game in their previous season that they didn't lose. And it was Carolina who reached for Bryce Young. And how well is that going? And so, yes, they traded up to get that 3rd overall pick, but from a quarterback standpoint, they actually stayed put. And when they lost that game, they weren't like, no, we need to go up to number 1. They're like, actually, we feel good about our scouting. We feel good about our intel, and we have a plan. And so I also think you look at the coaching staff they hired, the quarterback coach, the offensive coordinator, the other pieces they had that they kind of like kept excited. And so I think it's interesting that they failed before they succeeded.
We're in this world, C-Rob, now where when you are chasing the Chiefs, and everybody's chasing the Chiefs, you're essentially chasing an all-time great a head coach and an all-time great probably at the quarterback position working together. And I had somebody I was talking to about this earlier today. So that's an anomaly. Like, it's not anymore, because Brady and Belichick did this for a lot of years. And now Reed and Mahomes have taken that same thing. So, like, the method to being consistently a Super Bowl contender isn't just, what quarterback contract. Like, you got to find somebody that's as good as Mahomes, and you got to find somebody that's as good as Andy Reid. And, like, asking that just feels virtually impossible, right? Like, I mean, if you're the Bills, you're stuck against this ceiling that you can't break through. And you got to ask yourself, is that a Josh Allen issue? Is it a head coaching issue? What is, like, how do you compete against Reed and Mahomes other than waiting for one of them to get too rich to want to do it anymore?
Let's remember, too, even in the Patriots dynasty, right, there was the empty decade, right? There was an empty decade. They didn't win a Super Bowl. Okay. So there was a period of time where they weren't exactly in the desert. They were still winning a ton of games, and, they were running into some problems in the playoffs, or they ran into Eli Manning. But there was a period of time where some teams did manage to break through. And let's remember, throughout that dynasty, Tom Brady was perpetually underpaid. He was never the guy who was saying, hey, put me at the top of the quarterback heap every time he was coming up on a new contract. And that did matter, because they did spread money around on that team, particularly defensively. It's there are going to be different factors in different places. And I know right now, because of what just happened with the Chiefs, it feels like that Chiefs success is always going to be. I agree it is. I think there's going to be always some element of high level success. But there is also an inevitability that some things are going to start to go wrong inside Kansas City. Rashee Rice and the situation in Dallas right now, not ideal, okay, with the high-speed, drag racing incident, whether he was involved or not, and, he's cooperating with authorities. Okay, well, that's your guy.
Who's and he supposed said he took full accountability for what happened.
And he took full accountability, right? Well, guess what? He's going to deal with, there's going to be civil suits. There's going to be a lot of things going on now in his life that are going to be distracting. And this was a player that you expected coming out of last year when he broke through. Now, okay, he's on track. Now he's going to elevate in his next season. Okay, well, we'll see, because some stuff now has happened off the field. Travis Kelce, not getting any younger, seems to have a bright future ahead that does not necessarily involve football. Not going to dive into all that. Seems like he's in pretty good life, place moving forward. So maybe football doesn't have to be a huge part of that for much longer. We'll see. Yeah, there's going to be some trade-offs here, and that contract is going to continue to weigh. There's going to be especially high-level players. Now, if you have a great left tackle, if you have a great quarterback, if you have a great corner, if you have a great wide receiver, they're all making 25, 30, $35 million. Or if it's a quarterback, it's going to be 50, 55, $60 million a season. The cap's going to be going up. There's no doubt about that. But there is going to be a crush here and a pinch that continues to orbit around the Chiefs. And you know, I think there's an opportunity for other teams to break through here, probably in the next 5 or 6 years, if that's what your initial window is going to be. That aligns with Houston. I get it for Houston. I understand why they're doing what they're doing. I also understand the mini reboot in Buffalo, although I don't know what it will be yet. I'm still waiting to see. Really,
I love Charles's synonyms for rebuild.
It can't be. It's not. Like,
it's not a rebuild because
right?
you have Josh Allen, but nonetheless, if there is anyone who could write that,
that's a mini. It's a mini. Yeah, you're rebooting around him, right? I mean, even the Patriots rebooted around Brady over the years. You know, you saw they were swapping pieces in and out.
And I think you see Kansas City is not immune to these league trends, and I think that's what's challenging is the rate at which the salary cap is rising is not commensurate with the rate at which the quarterback position is rising, or even at a smaller level, the rate at which the rookie minimum is rising. And so you have certain positions where you start to really be pushing because of that, if you have anything but a rookie quarterback for the most part. And so it becomes an issue. And now, yes, Kansas City has weathered it in part because they don't only have Patrick Mahomes, but they have that combination of Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid. But I mean, we saw them lose Tyreek Hill. Now we're seeing them lose L'Jarius Sneed so that they could keep Chris Jones, which, by the way, if you're L'Jarius Sneed, you went from dealing with like whoever Denver and Las Vegas lined up at quarterback and then Justin Herbert being probably misused to now you have to face Trevor Lawrence, CJ Stroud, and Anthony Richardson. And if you're like, it's okay, I got the Houston receivers. Well, actually, you have Stefon Diggs now twice a year as well. So, yeah, rough. I'm sure he'll rise to the level of competition, but he's definitely going to have his hands full in that division.
Titans are feeling better, though, today. The Titans are like, oh, good, we addressed the right thing before this happened.
100%. I will say, I understand, like, you can, right now, I think you can punch holes in so many of the AFC teams. Like, Joe Burrow has a stay healthy issue. We don't want to call him injury prone, but he's injury prone, right? Like,
that's a good euphemism. I like it.
Thank you.
A stay healthy issue.
It is a stay healthy issue. The Ravens have lost a ton of people on their roster. There's no question about that. We're in a reboot now for Buffalo. We have no idea if the Dolphins really have their quarterback or they can actually beat a team that's great. The Chiefs are going to put more on Mahomes without L'Jarius Sneed. They're going to put more on their few stars to be able to carry all of the weight. Like, I see why the Texans are all in, because they can look around it and say, why not us? As weird as that sounds, like, why not us? Because there are fatal flaws in so many of the teams in the AFC we presume are going to be great. Why not Houston right now? I mean, it makes sense to me to take that standpoint.
Well, and the last time we saw a quarterback step in as a first-year starter, now he wasn't a rookie. Mahomes wasn't a rookie. It was the second year. But instantaneously, we were like, oh, they're going to be a problem. Like, this team is going to be a problem now. I don't think the Texans are on that level, because I don't think Stroud is on the Mahomes level, but he's pretty close to start. And, you know, you could argue his first year of starting versus Mahomes' first year of starting, pretty damn comparable. And, you know, the skill set, not necessarily all the same. And I get it. I'm not trying to compare the two players, but I'm saying in terms of the ignition button being pressed in an organization, you know, the Chiefs were like, oh yeah, like, we got it. We're good. Let's go. The Texans are in that position right now. They're like, we got it. And we have other pieces too. It's not just this guy. I agree with you. You look around the AFC and you can pull at some loose threads in every single organization. But that's how the NFL's built, right? They're always constantly, everything's geared to push you to the middle.
And by the way, not for nothing, you mentioned Mahomes had a year, and he's talked in interviews about how Alex Smith really helped him learn how to be a pro. I mean, CJ Stroud did what he did, and he didn't even get the playbook until late April. Like, that part of it is just, to me, C-Rob, that part of it is stunning.
And Fitz, I remember going into that draft and people still saying to me, Ohio State doesn't produce good quarterbacks. They all flop. They flop when they get to the NFL. Like, they're, you know, there's show me the great Ohio State quarterback who's really come out and made it. And at that time, they're even like pointing at Fields and going, you know, he just doesn't look like he's got some flashes here and there, but he also looks like it's going to be hard to, fully transform him into a high level NFL quarterback. So he, not only did he do it on short time with the playbook and all these other aspects of it, he did it coming from a place where there was still some doubt, that an Ohio State quarterback could be this dude. But I will say this about the process of believing some of the things you see. When he lit it up, when he really put that game together against Georgia, we were like, okay, like that's a lot of NFL players he's playing against. And he really played at a high level. And then he went through the process, and let's remove the whole S2 crap, the kind of wave of S2 stuff that happened. He went to the combine. We're like, pretty damn good. Like, that guy looks pretty awesome. He's going through workouts with teams. They're all saying the same things. Like, hey, this kid's high level. There was some truth, obviously, to the process, but it's a unicorn situation too. Let's be honest. I mean, even I invoke Detroit. I invoke what happens in Houston and sort of this turnaround. There is some lottery, some lottery winnings to this process. You have to hit on some things at a really high level in somewhat of an unexpected way for things to open up to you that quickly. Let's think about Seattle, like with Russ. Remember when they drafted Russ, and it's a 3rd round pick, and all of a sudden he steps on the field and we're like, whoa, okay. Like, Russ is translating to he's 5'10", but he's playing. It doesn't matter that he's 5'10". Look at the way this guy is playing. And then what do? They hit on these defensive draft picks, particularly in later rounds, where you had guys who, safeties, corners, linebackers, like all these guys who were not 1st round picks, who looked like all pro or Pro Bowl level players. You can't tell me there's not some lottery aspects to that, where you
luck. It's better to be lucky than good, Rob. But it's better to be lucky than good. I live by that mantra. Let me ask you guys one more question before we wrap all of this up about this entire thing. A simple question, complicated answer maybe, but Josh Allen. When he was drafted, a lot of people had negative opinions on Josh Allen. That first year he started, everybody had plenty to say. Then it felt like when he shut everybody up, everybody sort of stepped back. Now we're trying to figure out this middle ground. Within league circles, is there any doubt that Josh Allen can be him? Because that's what the Bills are banking on right now, is that Josh Allen can absolutely lift around. Is there any doubt in league circles that he can do that?
So here's the thing. I think you have to ask, what is him? How are we defining him? Is Josh Allen Patrick Mahomes? No. Is Josh Allen a top 2 to 5 quarterback? I think absolutely. I think Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, you've got a handful of other guys, Joe Burrow. But again, you guys mentioned the injury, the stay healthy challenges that he has. I think that Josh Allen is one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. He does elevate a team. And I also think what's cool is think about how much he's grown from the time he's got in the league until now. I think he has a lot of growth yet left. And so I think that what will be interesting is, if this year doesn't go well for Buffalo, to me, that will not be a referendum on Josh Allen. This will be a referendum on, we have not figured out how to maximize Josh Allen in the post-Brian Daboll era. How can we try and capture that? Now, I won't get into all of the hypotheticals of whether Brian Daboll could be available in 2025, because that would be fascinating if they try and reunite them. I also am just going to be interested, because when you think about the timing of this trade for Buffalo for their mini reboot, there's a part of me that could go either way. Is it we mini reboot this year because we have big looming questions about every team in our division and can maybe make the playoffs even if we don't have as good of a team? Because can you rely on Aaron Rodgers? What are you doing with Tua? And the Patriots are just not there yet. Or is this, let's give Aaron Rodgers 1 year and then we'll go back to running the show for the next 5 to 10. I can kind of see both ways. All of which is say, I think Josh Allen is the type of quarterback you sign and sign and sign. I know we're seeing in Dallas questions about whether you sign the guy when you have him, but I do think that you're not going to find, the likelihood of you finding an upgrade from Josh Allen is so small.
Oh, yeah, that's not even, come on. That's not even I would hope no one ever puts forward that conversation, because that's completely ridiculous. Your margins now at this point of improvement over Josh Allen are razor thin. Okay. And I'm not so concerned about the question, is Josh Allen Patrick Mahomes? You can ask that question and get the same result with pretty much every other quarterback in the league. What I'm concerned about is 2-3 years down the road, are we saying, is Josh Allen Phillip Rivers? What I mean by that is a prolific quarterback who puts up numbers, is clearly an elite at his position, and yet can't break through meaningfully in the postseason. Like, get it, punch into a Super Bowl. And it is possible over time, you start to see an organization never able to get all the resources around a quarterback and then that quarterback's talent marshaled at the same time to create an environment of going and winning a Super Bowl. It happened with Rivers. I remember one year, this obviously shows how old I am. It was like one year I remember the Chargers had 12 Pro Bowl players. And I thought to myself, they don't win it this year. Like, this is it. Like, come on, man. They got this is crazy, the amount of resources. They didn't. And sometimes it's an element of running into Tom Brady. Sometimes it's an element of, just postseason failures and the inability to win big games. Sometimes the offense and defense are not in the same place at the same time. Whatever it is, you can get a prolific quarterback who gets to that stage where, through the failures sometimes of themselves, through the failures sometimes of surrounding players, sometimes it's management, sometimes it's coaching, it turns into a prolific 15-year career where you're going, man, why did this really never happen for this player? We're always going to have Dan Marino to look back at and be like, oh yeah, remember that early success in the first couple of years of his career, where like he's going to be a Super Bowl quarterback repeatedly over the course of his career. He wasn't, but he was one of the most prolific passers in history, through some of the nicest footballs in history in an era when it was very difficult to be an unbelievable unhinged passer. It happens, and history repeats itself in the NFL often. We could be saying that about Josh Allen.
The only difference as we wrap this up, C-Rob, is that social media and 24-hour news cycles and shows where everybody scream at each other now put all that blame straight on a quarterback. And I strongly believe that if Dan Marino were a quarterback with the same career in today's world, it would take about 3 seasons before he would be trashed on national shows day in and day out for not being enough. Even though it's a terrible narrative, that's what happens. And inevitably, if Josh Allen doesn't break through, it won't be about the context or the whys and the hows. It'll just be, this guy's a bum. You can't pay him. He can't win a Super Bowl, because that's the lowest common denominator that we seem to always fall to. That's all I'm saying, right or wrong. All right, you guys, we've spent the whole hour on this one story because, frankly, it was big enough to warrant it, and we wanted to. But we appreciate you guys hanging out with all of us. Follow us on social media. Of course, C-Rob, as always, tell everybody how they can continue to support the incredible legacy of Terez Paylor.
Yeah, we got the 2024 All Juice team coming out in the next couple of days. Want to remind people, check out breakingtea.com/Terez for your All Juice tee or hoodie. Remember that proceeds from that go to support the Terez Paylor Scholarship at Howard University. You can also support that scholarship directly, as well as the one in his name at Missouri, if you check out our podcast description.
Yep. And while you're checking out that podcast description, go ahead and subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends, family, enemies, tell everybody to hang out with us. We'll be back next Thursday with more inside coverage.